whoever did this took their time. When this child's earbuds were recovered, they were soaked in blood. These devices were in her ear, perhaps. As she is being out, she didn't see this guy coming.
He just asked me if I ever killed somebody. I didn't ask him if he ever did, but he told me he has.
This is the story of Yhoana Arteaga, a young, talented, and smart girl who loved spending time with her family. Tragically, her life was cut short when she was found brutally murdered inside her family home. Her murder shocked and saddened the community as it involved a young and innocent victim. But before she died, she had done something that would lead the police straight to her killer.
911, what is the address of your emergency?
Hi. My sister, we just got home. She went home alone. They killed my sister. I don't know what to do.
Yhoana Arteaga was born in 2005 to her parents Patricia Velasquez and Marlon Arteaga. Sadly, when Yhoana was very young, her parents separated and Patricia took care of their 3 kids, including Yhoana, and moved to live in a trailer park home. Yhoana had 2 siblings, Oscar, who was 2 years younger, and Jocelyn, who was 2 years older. Patricia used to work as an architect in Mexico, but when she came to the United States and became a mother of 3, her life changed a lot. Despite facing difficulties, Patricia devoted most of her time to her children and was determined to be an amazing mom. She supported each of her kids' dreams, even though they were very different from one another. Yhoana was a computer enthusiast and a dedicated karate fighter. She had many passions, and Patricia was incredibly proud of her daughter's varied interests. Patricia strongly believed that Yhoana would achieve greatness no matter what career she pursued. However, Yhoana's life took a tragic turn on August 10th, 2017. On that day, she was alone at home, recovering from a broken ankle she got while skating. Since she was using crutches, she decided not to go out with her mom and siblings, opting to stay home and watch a movie in her room. But when her family returned, they discovered a horrifying scene that sent chills down their spines. When the police arrived at the scene, they found Patricia and Yhoana's sister, Jocelyn, crying desperately. Yhoana had suffered a terrible fate. She was tied to her bed and strangled. To see someone you love in such a condition, especially in their own home, was beyond imagination and very heartbreaking.
Yhoana's murder was one of the more brutal cases that I've reviewed. It happened in a location that I think that most 12-year-olds would feel safe and secure, and that's in their home. When this child was found, she was found with a martial arts belt wrapped around her neck, not once, but twice. It was secured in the back with a double knot.
Yhoana's martial arts belt, a symbol of her accomplishments, was used to strangle her. It was wrapped so tightly around her neck that blood vessels had popped into her eyes, face, and neck.
Whoever did this took their time. When this child's earbuds were recovered, they were soaked in these devices were in her ear, perhaps. As she is being choked out, she didn't see this guy coming.
Yhoana's pants were pulled down, indicating that the assailant had attempted to violate her.
There was a bit of disrobing that went on here. Anytime that you have the appearance of an event that might have a sexual connotation, you're always going to do the sexual assault kit.
Everyone who knew Yhoana was shocked and outraged by the cruelty of her death. Who would do something so horrible to an innocent 12-year-old girl? Her family wouldn't rest until the killer was caught and brought to book. The police started investigating the case by talking to people in the neighborhood. Since Yhoana was still very young and didn't have any romantic relationships or known enemies, the investigator focused on people with a criminal history living in the trailer park. And that led them to Roy Coons Jr., who lived just 2 doors away, and he had a long criminal record dating back 30 years. When the police first talked to him, there were no obvious signs of suspicion. They were simply going around asking people if they saw anything strange on the day of the incident.
How you doing? Doing well. You live here?
Yeah.
You been here pretty much all day, or
I've been in and out.
you never saw anything unusual, strange, nothing stood out to you? Like, I've never seen that guy before.
No.
Roy appeared like any ordinary next-door neighbor, and had it been any other person, the encounter might have ended there. However, the seasoned detectives were aware of his history, and they couldn't simply dismiss him as a potential suspect.
This is a man who has been arrested 102 times. And his first arrest started when he was 19 years old. In 1999, he was convicted of his third DUI guilty. 2001, he was guilty of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. 2006, he's guilty of 2 counts of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. 2010, guilty of aggravated burglary.
Many of Roy's arrests were because he violated the terms of his parole, showing that he kept getting into trouble without learning from his mistakes or feeling sorry for what he did. But what made it worse was that his crimes became more serious over time. It started with drunk driving, DUI, but then he went on to commit aggravated burglary, a very dangerous and horrifying crime. As the police investigated the case, they closely watched Roy's behavior to see if he might be involved. It wasn't surprising that he seemed really interested in what the police were doing, always hanging around outside his house, trying to find out what was going on. But what really caught the attention of the officers was his strange behavior when they went to his house to ask more questions.
Why are y'all keep telling me people?
Well, I was trying to calm you. I was trying to calm you down.
I know my property. I don't know nobody. I stay with myself.
Do you still have my phone number?
Yes, I have it. And I told him out there, they repeatedly kept on. I have his number. I know his name and everything.
Right.
And then they come up here and ask me the same question again.
Why would he act so defensively if he had nothing to hide? His aggressive behavior made the officers even more suspicious of him, and they began watching his behavior even more closely. Before long, they noticed that he always kept peeking in the direction of Yhoana's home.
Anytime that you're on the scene of one of those crimes and the police are there and the police are there for a long time, you're gonna have your looky-loos. You're gonna have your people that kind of stand around and watch. But there was something about Roy Coons that stood out to the female officer. She was the second officer that arrived on the scene, and she went, I feel like I need to go talk to him.
Of course, Roy didn't like that and acted even more aggressively towards the officer. But the officer put it quite plainly to him.
If you had a 12-year-old daughter that was killed, would you or would you not want us to do everything that we possibly can to find out what took place?
What happened down there? The daughter got killed. I know them, man.
It was strange that he would pretend not to know what was happening with his neighbors when he had been spending days staring at the scene. Also, why was he upset about the police interviewing him?
Are you agitated because of the horrors of what happened in your neighborhood? That's completely logical. But at the same token, you do have to recognize that law enforcement does need to do their job and do and conduct an investigation. Why can't you just provide the basic information needed so we can eliminate you as a suspect and move on to the next person?
Instead of simply answering the officer's questions politely and saying goodbye, Roy acted distant and unfriendly. This caught the officer's attention, and they decided to go back to his home. Finally, they directly asked him if he had anything to do with the murder of Yhoana Arteaga.
No, man, I'm not involved in that. I got enough going on.
And the only reason we want to talk to you a little more is because we were home a little more than everybody else.
And like I said, I'm inside most of the time. I don't come out because I know how I am.
Right.
And I get riled up.
Just keep my number. Okay.
I got your number.
And it changes.
If I see anything or hear anything at all,
You call.
I will.
When Roy mentioned that he knows how he is, it left room for speculation. Was he referring to being short-tempered, a criminal, or something else entirely? One can only speculate on his true intentions. What remained evident, though, was that he was a 45-year-old man residing with his parents, lacking a stable job, and spending the majority of his time indoors. Given the mounting suspicion surrounding Roy, the police deemed it necessary to gather DNA evidence from his home. But since they knew Roy would not give out a sample without a warrant, they simply picked up one of the cigarette butts he'd thrown out onto his front lawn.
If you find something that has been discarded, there will be some element of you perhaps left behind. And what finer example of this than a cigarette butt? You're touching the exterior of the cigarette. But more importantly, you're essentially inoculating and introducing your saliva into the filter.
The cigarette bud was sent to the lab, and a DNA profile was drafted to be compared with the DNA found at the crime scene. But things would not be that easy. As the police became more focused on Roy Coons Jr., they began posing direct questions to him regarding the potential motive behind the killer's actions.
I mean, I really don't know that much to put an idea on what happened or, what they had going on, or if you go into the house and she, surprised them. But I mean, even then, still, that wouldn't make no sense. If one turn a murder into a murder, I guess it's one of those things you just have to put yourself in that situation to find out.
It appeared that Roy was suggesting a theory of a botched robbery. Someone might have waited for the family to leave the house to sneak in and steal valuables, but they hadn't anticipated the presence of the little girl. In a state of panic, they attacked her. However, the detectives wondered if Roy had more information or if he was merely speculating while speaking to the police. Further questioning followed, focusing on Roy's whereabouts on the day of the murder. He claimed to have gone out only to buy cigarettes and walk a friend's dog. When asked about his last interactions with Patricia or her children, he said that he would occasionally help by cutting her lawn.
Have you been inside since Patricia owned it?
Just the doorway. Sunday or Monday, when I went down there and asked her about the lawnmower, she down in the lawnmower, and then a couple of times prior to that.
The detectives skillfully continued questioning him as they waited for the lab results. They wanted to find any links or clues that could help them uncover the truth.
Is there any reason that we could ever possibly find your DNA on her?
I mean, I shook their hand and stuff like that.
When the lab results came back, the DNA match showed a much more troubling interaction than a simple handshake. They found Roy's DNA on various things inside Yhoana's house, like the back of a windowsill, a shirt, and a sock. They also found a YSTR match on different parts of Yhoana's body, like her cheek, left arm, and bottom. Surprisingly, Roy's DNA wasn't on the martial arts belt used to kill her, and none of the fingerprints found at the crime scene matched his. This mixed evidence left the police confused and uncertain about where to go next with the investigation.
It's very difficult many times to find a latent print, or we don't have prints on the ends of our fingers. These are easily obliterated. You got to keep in mind, and this is quite fascinating, the day after the homicide, Coons was actually walking down the road, and there was a police officer that was there. One of the things that the police officer noticed is that Coons had latex gloves hanging out of his pocket during that interaction.
This made the police even more suspicious of Roy. He was wearing gloves, so there were no fingerprints left behind, but they found his DNA inside the house, even though he said he had never been inside. Despite these confusing discoveries, the police still asked Roy if he had seen anyone suspicious around the area before Yhoana's murder.
Can't see any strange vehicles out here.
There was 2 Mexicans down there fighting. And one of them was in a truck, a big custom truck or something, and came up this way. There's a green Toyota truck. And every time he comes up down through there, he almost stops real slow.
The idea sounded a bit silly, but the officers couldn't just ignore it because there were other fingerprints found at the crime scene. They thought maybe Roy was involved in something strange with a couple of other people, and he was trying to blame them to avoid getting in trouble. They decided they needed to investigate this further to figure out what really happened in this confusing situation.
There were other profiles of other men's DNA that were found on that scene, in that room, and on her body.
Now, while this was going on, Roy's dad was fiercely defending him on TV.
I know him better than that, and he ain't the type to do that. Yeah, they come in like a herd of buffaloes, machine guns, both sides, round through there, round through here.
By now, Roy was officially a suspect, and the police even told reporters that they had DNA evidence linking him to the crime.
Scientific evidence analyzed by both the Metro Police Department and the TBI crime laboratories was crucial in this investigation.
The police gathered information from Yhoana's family and the neighbors, and it became clear that Roy had hardly ever met Yhoana. He had only cut the family's grass a few times and shook hands with Patricia. There was no reason for his DNA to be inside the house. Surprisingly, despite this, Roy seemed horrified by the idea of someone killing an innocent child.
I wouldn't kill a child if somebody had a gun. I'm not going to let you take that a child. And if I had some kind of knowledge, I would know what I had to do to protect her if it cost me my life.
When the officer asked him what he thinks should happen to the killer, Roy gave an interesting answer.
Same thing. Whatever happened to her should happen to him. I would pretty much make sure that they endure whatever my child is.
But then, Roy unknowingly let something slip.
Like I was telling you yesterday, Miss Joe's sister-in-law doesn't take me down there stuff like that.
This information had not been made public, and there was no way any family member he spoke about could have known those specific details. The police had kept the details about the SA and strangulation private, and only Yhoana's family knew about them. In police investigations, it's crucial not to share such sensitive details with anyone outside the investigation, as it could compromise the case.
First off, he was hanging around, and now he has intimate knowledge of a scene, something that no one else has had eyes on.
Still, this wasn't enough to arrest Roy, because as retired Detective Melissa Pinkerton would explain, people often overhear such details, even though the police try to contain them.
I used to work on Dickerson Road, and it's filled with apartment complexes and trailer parks. And when you get on a scene like that, I know that the police say it wasn't out there, but people are talking. I do believe it's possible that it could have been overheard and the game of telephone got played that, oh, she was handled.
But the case would eventually turn around when detectives decided to look into Yhoana's phone conversations. When the detectives checked Yhoana's last messages, they found her final conversation with her mother. At 4:15 p.m. on August 10th, Yhoana messaged Patricia.
Mom, someone is knocking on the door. And then at 4:19, the victim wrote back to her mother, I think it was the man who cuts the yard.
And who do you think she was referring to? That's right, Roy Coons Jr. Yhoana's message was the only evidence indicating that Roy was present at the crime scene when the murder occurred. This text message was a crucial piece of evidence, placing him there and in contact with Yhoana around the time she was murdered. Now, a grim picture was forming. Roy Coons was a predator. He had been lurking around the house, waiting for the adults to leave so he could enter. He seemed to know their schedule, indicating he had been stalking them for a long time before making his final move. In September 2017, Roy Coons Jr. was arrested and charged with the murder and attempted of Yhoana Arteaga. Ironically, Roy had offered the police advice on how to catch the person responsible for the crime. He suggested using technology to gather information from people in the community who might have seen or heard something when the family wasn't home. Little did he know that his own actions would lead to his downfall.
Technology. Pretty much everybody around here, either we know people wasn't home or wasn't nothing saw or heard, so it's left up to the technology guys working. And they got to put a lot of hours in, they can't arrest.
When news of his arrest reached the Tennessee community, it didn't come as a surprise.
Day one. I seen him out mowing yards thinking, he's got the nerve.
Apparently, Roy had even shown up at Yhoana's vigil.
I walked over and I put a candle in his hand, and all he did was dropped his head and walked away. My gut feeling was, he's got a guilty conscience.
Roy wasn't the only one with a guilty conscience. Tennessee police also felt troubled by the fact that he had been arrested multiple times and had numerous parole violations, yet he was still free to commit robbery and even murder.
I don't think there's a member of this police department that's not troubled by the fact that when we arrest people, that very, very often for violent crimes, that they have been arrested many times before and convicted, but are yet on the streets.
Most people were relieved that Roy Coons Jr. was in custody, held without bail, except perhaps for his family. However, his trial posed a major challenge. There were no witnesses who could confirm that Roy was at Yhoana's home on the day of the crime. Also, apart from some questionable DNA found inside the house, there was no other physical evidence to tie him directly to the scene.
DNA YSTR profile on the right cheek, on the right buttocks, and it was the exact same YSTR profile as Roy Coons Jr.
All the evidence against Roy was circumstantial, which means it wasn't direct proof of his guilt. In many cases, this kind of evidence might not be enough to convict someone, even for a serious charge like murder. His defense team was quite aggressive in pointing this out.
You're not going to hear from a single eyewitness that Mr. Coons went in that mobile home on that day. You're not going to see any video footage from security cameras showing that he did that. You're not going to hear from any witnesses that he had any motive or had attempted to do anything to this family in the past.
The defense attorney also argued that the DNA found was just a few cells, not enough to link him to attempted sexual assault or murder because there was no bodily fluids present. However, in Roy's case, the circumstances surrounding him were pretty strong. Remember that comment he made to the investigators?
He knows that Yhoana has been shot. That information was not public at the time the defendant knew it.
There were also Yhoana's damning messages.
4:19 p.m. she identifies that the man who was knocking on the door of her trailer that day was the man who cuts the lawn. All the proof you've heard has shown that Roy Coons was the man who cut their lawn in that trailer.
And there was something else. After killing Yhoana, Roy fled to a nearby homeless shelter, thinking he would be safe from the police and the community in his neighborhood. While he was there, he started talking to a man named Moses.
He just asked me if I ever killed somebody. I didn't ask him if he ever did, but he told me he has. He didn't tell me who he was or how long he was, but he said he did. This is his word, that sticks with you. That's what he said. I was so freaked out. I never get scared.
Just imagine hearing something so disturbing from a stranger you happen to be living with at the shelter. Moses didn't know about the investigation initially, but when he found out, he came forward as a witness. His testimony became the final piece of evidence the jury needed to wrap up the case against Roy.
He's got this burden, this thing that gnaws at him. He's sleeping in a wooded area not too far away from the victim, and I think that tells you a lot.
On July 15th, 2019, the jury had a clear verdict.
We, the jury, find the defendant Ronald Donald Coons Jr. in count 1, guilty of second-degree murder. Count 2, felony murder, guilty.
Roy was on the verge of shedding a tear, but it was too late for any sorrow. Sadly, these tears weren't signs of remorse. He was only upset because he had lost his freedom. The court sentenced him to life in prison, and they added 25 more years on top of that. In 2020, there was news about Roy Coons Jr. again. This time, he was on trial for the sexual assault of Yhoana Arteaga, but still claimed that he was innocent.
I can't apologize for a crime I didn't commit, but I will say I'm sorry for your loss.
Did he really think telling a lie would change his fate now? Patricia would go on to talk about how losing her daughter in such a terrible way completely changed her life.
Everything has changed. Our lives have changed completely. It has destroyed my family.
She says that she still cries every day, unable to forget the day she returned home with her 2 children and discovered Yhoana in that horrifying state. It's something you can't forget or forgive. Yhoana Arteaga's murder is a tragic reminder of the need to work collectively to promote a safer and more compassionate world for everyone. Let us remember Yhoana and all those who have lost their lives under similar circumstances, and may their memories inspire us to strive for a society where such tragedies can be prevented and justice is served. Our sincere condolences to the family and friends of Yhoana Arteaga.